Imagine the world just weeks after the most devastating conflict in human history. Cities lay in ruins, millions had perished, and the Allies stood victorious. But the question on everyone's mind was, what happens now? Especially to the men who masterminded the horrors of Nazi Germany, the infamous leaders who orchestrated war crimes, genocide, and a tyranny that scarred the world forever. Well, buckle up, because the story of their fate after World War II is just as brutal and gripping as the war itself. Now, before we dive in, let's address the obvious. These guys weren't exactly your friendly neighborhood leaders. They were responsible for atrocities so horrific they make your skin crawl. So it's no surprise that justice wasn't going to be a gentle, polite affair. From dramatic courtroom showdowns to secretive escapes, from suicides in prison cells to daring kidnappings, these men faced consequences that echoed the severity of their crimes. Some met the hangman's noose, others tried to slip away into the shadows of history, and a few even managed to live out their days in captivity, haunted by their own deeds. But this isn't just a grim history lesson. It's a gripping tale of justice, revenge, politics, and sometimes a bit of dark irony. Like Hermann Göring, the flamboyant Luftwaffe commander who, after being sentenced to death, decided he'd rather cheat the executioner by swallowing a cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled hanging. Talk about going out with a bang. Or Heinrich Himmler, head of the feared SS, who, caught trying to pass as a common soldier, ended his life in a less than dignified way with a concealed poison capsule. It's almost as if these men knew that the consequences of their actions were closing in, and they chose to control their own fate in the final moments. Throughout this video, we'll travel through the tense post-war years, exploring the massive Allied efforts to track down these war criminals. We'll sit in the historic Nuremberg trials courtroom, witness the dramatic verdicts, and peel back the layers of the individual stories that unfolded after the war. And just so you know, there will be moments that make you question humanity, and moments that remind you of the relentless pursuit of justice. So, grab your history hats and settle in. Whether you're a history buff or just here for the jaw-dropping drama, this story about the brutal fate of Nazi leaders is one you won't want to miss. To understand what happened to these Nazi leaders after the war, first, we need to get a sense of who they were and just how deep their crimes ran. These weren't just politicians or military commanders. They were architects of some of the darkest chapters in human history. You've heard the names. Adolf Hitler, of course, the Führer who ignited the flames of war and hatred. But behind him stood a terrifying lineup of men who executed his twisted vision with ruthless efficiency. There was Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and the man who turned the Nazi paramilitary into a terrifying police state within Germany and occupied Europe. Himmler was the mastermind behind the concentration camps, orchestrating the systematic murder of millions. Then you had Hermann Göring, a flamboyant and notoriously self-indulgent character who led the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Known for his swagger and ego, Göring was second only to Hitler in power, overseeing the plundering of occupied territories and the creation of the Gestapo's infamous Gestapo. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy for a long time, was a mysterious figure whose bizarre solo flight to Scotland in 1941 shocked the world. Though less directly involved in the Holocaust, he was a key player in Nazi policy. Other figures like Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, wove the poisonous narratives that fueled hatred and justified genocide. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, managed to keep the Nazi war machine running by producing weapons and supplies, knowing full well what his regime was doing. And of course, Adolf Eichmann, the logistical genius behind the final solution, who organized the deportation of millions of Jews to extermination camps. What did all these men have in common? They were part of a regime responsible for the deaths of an estimated 17 million civilians in the Holocaust alone, plus tens of millions more casualties in the wider war. It's hard to even fathom the scale of horror. Concentration camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became the names of death itself. War crimes weren't limited to the camps. Mass executions, forced labor, medical experiments, and the brutal occupation of entire countries. These atrocities left scars that still haunt us today, Because of this, when the war ended in 1945, the Allies faced an enormous challenge. How do you bring justice to a world shattered by such cruelty? How do you punish those responsible while trying to rebuild peace? They knew that simply wiping the slate clean wasn't an option. The world needed accountability. And so began one of the most ambitious legal and moral undertakings in history: to hunt down these men, put them on trial, and ensure that justice was served. But it wasn't going to be easy. Many of these men had vanished into hiding. Others tried to cover their tracks, and some even took their own lives before facing the consequences. In the next part, we'll dive into how the Allies hunted down these leaders through daring operations, intelligence work, and sheer determination. But for now, just remember this: the men we're talking about weren't just ordinary soldiers or officials. They were the driving forces behind unimaginable evil, and their fate after the war was going to reflect just how serious the world was about justice. So, the war was over. The Allies had won, but the job was far from finished. The biggest question now was, where are these Nazi leaders hiding? Because believe me, most of them weren't just waiting politely to be handed over like lost puppies. The hunt was on. Allied forces, intelligence agencies, and even regular soldiers went on a massive manhunt across Europe and beyond. The goal? To track down the architects of Nazi terror and bring them to justice. Let's start with one of the most notorious, Heinrich Himmler. The man responsible for the SS and the concentration camps tried to sneak out of Germany disguised as a common soldier. But it didn't work for long. In May 1945, British troops captured him. But Himmler didn't want to stand trial. Within hours of being caught, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule, essentially taking his own life before the Allies could question him. Talk about going out on your own terms, if not exactly the heroic way. Then there was Hermann Göring, Hitler's former right-hand man and the flamboyant leader of the Luftwaffe. When the Allies found him, Göring had basically been living the high life, indulging in luxury and power until the very end. After surrendering, he tried to negotiate for leniency, even attempting to bribe his captors. No luck there. He was put on trial in Nuremberg, but, in a final act of defiance, swallowed cyanide the night before his scheduled execution. Guess he didn't want to hang around that long. And what about Rudolf Hess? Now, Hess's story is straight out of a thriller novel. In 1941, he mysteriously flew solo to Scotland, without Hitler's permission, to try to negotiate peace. The British didn't exactly welcome him with open arms. He was imprisoned for years, awaiting trial after the war ended. His fate? Life imprisonment in Spandau prison, where he spent decades until his death under suspicious circumstances. But not all the Nazis were caught so easily. Many high-ranking officials went into hiding, often with the help of secret escape networks. Some fled to South America, where countries like Argentina became infamous for harboring war criminals. These rat lines were well-organized escape routes, often run by sympathetic clergy or ex-Nazis, helping their comrades disappear into the shadows. The Allies also had to rely on intense intelligence work. The Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, along with British and Soviet agents, combed through leads, interrogated witnesses, and tracked suspicious movements. Some captures were dramatic. Take Adolf Eichmann, for example. Eichmann had escaped to Argentina and was living under a false identity. In 1960, Israeli Mossad agents conducted a daring covert operation, kidnapping him and secretly bringing him to Israel to face trial for his crimes. His capture and trial became a watershed moment in global awareness of the Holocaust, and not to forget the ordinary soldiers and citizens who helped. Many civilians turned in suspects, and countless documents and testimonies surfaced, giving clues to the whereabouts of Nazi fugitives. But even with all these efforts, some Nazi leaders vanished completely. Take Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death from Auschwitz. He slipped through the net, living under various aliases across South America until his death in 1979, never brought to formal justice. The hunt was a long, complicated game of cat and mouse, filled with unexpected twists and turns. But the message was clear. No matter how far or how cleverly they tried to hide, the world was watching, and justice would find them. In the next section, we'll explore the landmark Nuremberg trials, where many of these captured leaders faced the consequences of their actions in a courtroom that changed history forever. With the war finally over and the Nazi leaders rounded up, or at least some of them, the Allies faced an enormous challenge: how to hold these men accountable for crimes so vast and horrific that the world had never seen their like before. Enter the Nuremberg trials, a groundbreaking series of military tribunals held in the city of Nuremberg, Germany, from November 1945 to October 1946. This wasn't just any courtroom drama. It was the trial that set the precedent for international justice. Why Nuremberg? The city had symbolic weight, a stronghold for Nazi rallies and propaganda, now transformed into the site where justice would be served. The Allies, primarily the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, joined forces to create the International Military Tribunal, tasked with trying 24 of the most significant surviving Nazi leaders. This wasn't about petty crimes. They faced charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, including the systematic genocide of millions. The defendants were an intimidating bunch: Hermann Göring, the suave but ruthless Luftwaffe leader; Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister; Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German armed forces; Albert Speer, the armaments minister, and many more. The courtroom itself was packed, not only with lawyers and judges, but journalists, diplomats, and world leaders eager to witness history. One of the most striking aspects of the trials was the meticulous presentation of evidence. The prosecution brought forward thousands of documents, films, and eyewitness testimonies, some so graphic and chilling, they shook even the most hardened onlookers. You can almost imagine the atmosphere. Göring sitting in the defendant's dock, arrogantly confident one moment and visibly shaken the next, as survivors recounted their stories and the massive scale of atrocities unfolded. The defendants tried various tactics. Some pleaded innocence, others claimed they were just following orders. But the tribunal wasn't having it. A key legal breakthrough came with the recognition that following orders was not a defense for crimes that were so morally reprehensible. One of the trial's most impactful moments was the presentation of the Wannsee Protocol document, which detailed the chilling plans for the final solution, the Nazi plan to exterminate the 6 million Jewish population of Europe. By the end of the trials, 12 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, including Göring, though he escaped execution through suicide, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and others. 3 were acquitted, and the rest received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. The Nuremberg trials not only served justice, but created a new legal framework for prosecuting war crimes internationally, a legacy that would influence tribunals decades later, from Yugoslavia to Rwanda. The trials also sparked intense debate. Some argued the process was victor's justice, accusing the Allies of hypocrisy. But most agree it was a necessary step toward healing a world devastated by war. Beyond the legalities, the trials sent a powerful message. No one, not even heads of state, was above the law. For many survivors and victims' families, the trials were a long-awaited recognition of their suffering and a promise that the world would remember. So what happened to these men after the courtroom verdicts? Some met their end at the gallows, others faced decades behind bars, and a few lived with the burden of their crimes until their final days. Now that we've seen how the Nuremberg trials shook the world, it's time to zoom in on the personal stories of the men who sat in those docks, the men whose names still send shivers down history's spine. Let's start with Hermann Göring. The man was larger than life, the dashing commander of the Luftwaffe, known for his love of cigars, medals, and ostentatious fashion. At the trials, Göring put on a show, sometimes arrogant, sometimes defiant. He tried to charm the judges, but the evidence was overwhelming. Convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to death by hanging. But Göring had one last trick up his sleeve. The night before his scheduled execution, he swallowed a hidden cyanide capsule. The guards found him dead in his cell. Some say it was cowardice, others see it as a final act of control. Either way, Hermann Göring avoided the hangman's noose. a brutal end fitting for a man whose crimes were equally brutal. Next, there's Heinrich Himmler, arguably one of the darkest figures of the Nazi regime. As head of the SS and architect of the concentration camps, his hands were stained with unimaginable bloodshed. After Hitler's suicide and Germany's defeat, Himmler tried to disappear, even changing his appearance and using false documents. But fate caught up with him in May 1945 when British soldiers arrested him. During interrogation, Himmler bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule and died shortly after. It was a swift, desperate end. A man who tried to escape justice, but ultimately met it on his own terms. Then there's Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy and a figure shrouded in mystery. His bizarre solo flight to Scotland in 1941 was an act that baffled both Nazis and Allies alike. After the war, Hess was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to life imprisonment. He spent decades locked away in Spandau prison, isolated and largely forgotten by the world. In 1987, at the age of 93, Hess was found dead in his cell, officially ruled a suicide, but whispers of conspiracy and foul play still linger. Albert Speer, the so-called Nazi who said sorry, was Hitler's architect and armaments minister. Unlike many of his colleagues, Speer accepted responsibility during his trial, expressing remorse for the regime's crimes. He was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison and, after his release, spent years reflecting on his actions and writing memoirs. Though his sincerity remains debated, Speer's story is a stark contrast to the defiance of other Nazis, a reminder that even among monsters, shades of complexity exist. One of the most famous post-war Nazi stories belongs to Adolf Eichmann. The man was the logistical mastermind behind the final solution, organizing the transportation of millions of Jews to their deaths. After the war, Eichmann fled to Argentina, living under a false identity. But in 1960, Israeli Mossad agents located him, captured him in a daring covert operation, and brought him to trial in Jerusalem. The world watched as Eichmann was convicted of crimes against humanity and executed by hanging in 1962, the first time a Holocaust perpetrator was tried publicly and given the death penalty. Eichmann's trial brought global attention to the horrors of the Holocaust and ensured his name would forever be synonymous with evil. But not all Nazi leaders were caught or punished. Josef Mengele, the infamous angel of death at Auschwitz, escaped capture despite being one of the most wanted men. Known for his cruel medical experiments on prisoners, Mengele slipped through post-war manhunts and lived under various aliases in South America until his death by drowning in 1979. His story became a haunting symbol of how some evildoers evaded justice. And what about Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and a shadowy figure in the Nazi hierarchy? Bormann vanished in the chaotic last days of the war, presumed dead for decades until his remains were discovered in Berlin in the 1970s. While he never faced trial, his fate was sealed by the collapse of the regime he helped run. Each of these stories highlights the brutal and often tragic ends faced by those responsible for some of history's worst crimes. Some died by their own hands, others by execution or imprisonment, and a few by evading the law entirely. It's a chilling reminder that while justice was sought, it was imperfect, and the shadows of those dark times linger. So, what have we learned from the brutal fate of the Nazi leaders captured after World War II? These men, who once wielded terrifying power and orchestrated unimaginable horrors, faced a reckoning that was as complex and fraught as the war itself. Some met justice in a courtroom. Others died by their own hands before they could face the consequences. A few slipped away into the shadows, reminding us that justice is often imperfect. But what stands out most is the message the world sent through these trials and hunts, that crimes against humanity cannot be ignored or forgotten. The Nuremberg trials created a blueprint for holding leaders accountable, no matter how high their rank or how powerful their influence. At the same time, the aftermath showed us the messy, raw human emotions unleashed by war. Revenge, grief, and the thirst for justice blurred lines, sometimes leading to harsh acts beyond legal frameworks. It was a harsh lesson on the challenges societies face in the wake of conflict. Yet these stories also highlight resilience, of survivors demanding recognition, of communities rebuilding, and of international efforts striving to uphold justice and human rights. So next time you hear the names Göring, Himmler, or Eichmann, remember the full story. A story of cruelty and consequence, of justice and its limits. If there's one takeaway from today's video, it's that history matters. Because by remembering the brutal fate of those who caused so much pain, we stay vigilant against the forces that allow such evil to rise. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive into history insightful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more compelling stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of these stories impacted you the most? Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep learning.